Hello, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on our upcoming concert, Contemporary Jewish Voices, featuring Associate Conductor James K. Bass and musicologist Judah Cohen. My name is Danny Yanez, and I am honored to serve as the new Executive Director of Seraphic Fire. With a background in nonprofit leadership and a passion for the arts, I'm excited to work alongside our talented team to support Seraphic Fire's mission as we continue enriching South Florida's cultural landscape. I look forward to getting to know all of you and helping this incredible organization grow. Before we get started, please keep yourself muted during the show. We will open for questions at the end of the lecture. We are recording this lecture, which will be posted on YouTube and adapted for our Seraphic Saturday podcast. If you enjoy it, feel free to share it with your friends or listen again. Thank you again for being here, and without further ado, I'll hand things over to James Bass.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and welcome everybody to our conversation today and our subsequent podcast that will occur later. So my name, in case you don't know me, I'm James Bass. This is my 22nd season with Seraphic Fire. So other than Patrick Quigley and Joanne Schulte, I think I'm the next most senior member. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to get together. I love the format that we're using this year. And for those of you who this might be your first time, this is the second installment of conversations that are at the intersection of performance and scholarship. All of our concerts this year include performance repertoire curated by all of the different conductors. But then in addition to that, we have a scholar that has been working with us conductors along the way to talk about programming, and of course to be here today to give even further information and light on the subject matters that we are exploring this season. So our season, most of you already know this if you started with Seraphic Fire a couple of weeks ago, is Music History 101. And I would ask you, how many of you have taken Music History 101 at some point in your life? And so now here we are taking it again, but in a just a more luxurious way. You get to actually talk about it, hear the music live, see the artists. It's really a special way. And when Patrick proposed this as a season, I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. So our aim is to shed light on all different types of music that we perform. As you know, our last performance was tongue-in-cheek, a brief history of Western music. And today we're going to talk about something much more acute, much more specific than that. And so our discussion will be basically couched and housed around contemporary Jewish music and contemporary Jewish composers. A little later in our conversation, I'm going to talk with you all about how the program came to be, how it was compiled. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce you to today's scholar, Judah Cohen. Judah, first of all, we owe you a wonderful thank you because Mark Kligman, who is the original scholar on this endeavor, had to go through some, had a medical treatment, is not going to be able to be with us today, but Judah was so gracious in joining us. He is an Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs, Research, and Creative Activity, and the Professor of Musicology at the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music, as well as the Lou and Sybil Mervis Professor of Jewish Culture, and the Robert A. and Sandra S. Burns Jewish Studies program in the college. His research interests include music in Jewish life, American music, musical theater, popular culture, Caribbean Jewish history, diaspora, and medical ethnomusicology. His doctoral work, he explored the meaning of becoming a Reformed Jewish cantor at the turn of the 21st century, based on 3 years of ethnographic study with cantorial students. He has a rich and very, very illustrious biography. Judah, we welcome you.
Thank you, James. It's such a pleasure to be here and such a pleasure to be able to work with you. It has been just a thrill to be able to also work with the full team. I look forward to our conversation.
And why don't you talk to us a little bit about those things that you've researched in the past, those things that have brought you the most interest, and what you think you bring to this to the community?
Sure. I mean, one of the questions that I often get asked is how does someone become a scholar of Jewish music? I can give you at least a little bit of background on me, and everybody, of course, has their own story that goes along with it. And there are several colleagues of mine, including Mark Kligman, who is a dear friend and dear colleague. It is, again, has been someone that I've worked with now for many years. For me, I grew up in a conservative Jewish family on the East Coast in New Jersey, and at the same time, this my family was also very much involved not just in Jewish life, but also in music, often more in folk music, but also in terms of encouraging us to be able to look very carefully and closely at what it meant for us to sing and what it meant for us to be able to really participate in kind of group music making. Uh, Over the course of that time, I started to become interested in what it meant to think about Jewish music, not just as something that was, what I did in synagogue, and not just as something that I learned how to sing when it came to folk songs, but also about the history of what it meant to think about this very relationship between music and Jewish life. When I was in college, I started to really get an opportunity to explore that, not just as a music major, and as a music major who would be able to start asking questions alongside my knowledge and my growing knowledge about the history of Western music. But also because I had the opportunity to work with and to found actually a fantastic a cappella group called Magevet, which translates of all things as towel. We can talk about that in a totally different conversation. But during that time, I had a chance to think about the relationship between Judaism and choral music, which goes back probably about, I would say, more than 400 years. Or so. And so I had a chance to kind of think through each one of these eras, going back to the music of Salomone de' Rossi in the 17th century, through to the revival, if you will, or the creation of a Jewish choral music scene around the turn of the 20th century, and into what became a kind of a Jewish a cappella sub culture in the 20th and 21st century. From there, that began to make me realize that there was a real uh, what would I say? That there was a real field of Jewish music that could be explored. And that's what I did for my graduate work. During my graduate work, I spent, as you identified, a whole bunch of time in 3 years at the Hebrew Union College School of Sacred Music, working with cantorial students. During that time, I was researching how students would come into the school really interested in Jewish music, interested in Judaism, and interested in becoming really vessels of Jewish music for the communities that they would eventually serve. And what I saw over those 3 years was how students would transform into these vessels. They would learn what Jewish music history was. They would try to really experiment with and explore different repertoires, synagogue repertoires, but also repertoires of Jewish music that existed outside of the synagogue. And they would also do all kinds of really important and interesting presentations. The term that was used at the time and still is the practicum, where they would be given these repertoires and they would have to present them in a meaningful way to their peers and also to a large group of attendees. Through that, I began to explore and understand what it meant not just to think about Jewish music as a 2,000-year-old tradition, but Jewish music as a tradition that is a contemporary tradition that is based on a perception of hundreds and thousands of years of activity. From there, I have gone on in other directions as well. Among the things that I've really enjoyed looking at have been looking at not just Jewish music today, but also trying to understand in the 19th century in America how there was a significant population of people that were also interested in developing a Jewish musical style and Jewish musical experiences that we often don't hear about because much of the work that we talk about is European. I've also had a chance to go through and look at a variety of different areas, whether it be music in the Jewish Caribbean, or for that matter, the relationship between Jews and hip hop, or the representation of Jews in American musical theater. In each one of these cases, it's been for me a fantastic journey to try and understand and think about what it has meant for not just stories that are connected to the Jewish experience to be told, but also how communities help to create this idea of Judaism through the sounds that they produce.
Thank you, Judah, so much for sharing that with us. And of course, we knew you're an expert, but now we're even more fully convinced of that. So just to share with everyone that's here on our discussion panel today, most of you, again, I think most of you know me. In addition to being a singer and being with Seraphic Fire for the 22 seasons, I have served as its associate conductor for the majority of that time as well, and get the privilege of conducting Seraphic Fire at least once, almost every year, and sometimes several times a year. And so I have a relationship with programming for this ensemble, this amazing vocal ensemble, in lots of different ways. And Patrick Quigley, our artistic director, will ask us guest conductors each year in advance to conduct a particular program. And most of the time, Patrick will select a program that sits in the kind of wheelhouse, so to speak, of that conductor, so that those conductors are bringing the things and the type of music that they're most comfortable with, most familiar with, and can really experience it with our audiences in a way that is authentic. Absolutely. So Patrick approached me and said, hey, we're doing Music History 101 for the upcoming season, and I would like for you to conduct a program on contemporary Jewish music and composers. And I thought for a second, wait a minute, why? But then I realized why. I'm a professor at UCLA and have been since 2016, and have a wonderful array of opportunities as a professor there. But UCLA has a quite large Jewish studies program. And in addition to that, within the Herb Alpert School of Music, where I teach, is the Lowell Milken Center for American Jewish Music. And over the last 7 years, I have served as a conductor for a lot of the events that Lowell Milken Institute and Center has presented. So it's put me in contact with Jewish composers, Jewish themes, Jewish events. And I think that Patrick realized that at least allowed me some experience to say I have people to talk to, I have musical experience on which to draw, to create this program in an authentic way, as well as I possibly can, not being a Jewish person. So I think that that's how Patrick came to land on me for this program, and now I'm very, very grateful that he did. When starting the process of programming for this concert, I began absolutely fresh, decided to just start looking in places I've never looked, reached out to experts and asked, where would I be looking for Jewish music? What kind of publishing houses specialize in Jewish composers and Jewish thematic music? And so it really was a square one kind of process for me. And I am proud to say, for all of you longtime Seraphic attendees, every single piece on this program has never been performed by Seraphic Fire. Every single work is a brand new work to us, although it may not be a new work to the choral community. And every single composer is alive. So this is about as fresh as we can get in this topic, and it's exciting. And I'll add one more aside, something I learned as I was going through this, because through the course of my own life, from Interlaken and beyond, I've had just almost an innumerable amount of colleagues and friends and musical colleagues that come from the Jewish community. In the 2020 census for the United States, only 2.4% of the US population identified as Jewish. That blew my mind because of how often I have come in contact with Jewish performers, Jewish composers, which are also performers, and Jewish musicians of all types. And maybe I was just involved in the small community of classical music making, and a lot of Jewish performers perhaps end up there. But the fact that this very small segment of our population has made such an enormous contribution to the national, at least national, and then international scene, I thought was quite striking. And I wanted to make sure I shared that with everyone, because it certainly came to my mind as I went through this. All right, Judah, so another question. You're aware of our Music 101 overall theme for the year. Why is contemporary Jewish music included in a Music 101 series?
James, that's a really great question. And it's a question that, when we've talked about it and as we kind of continue to think about it, really has some fascinating answers to me that can go along with it, or ways to be able to respond. One of them is that when we like to think about this question of what contemporary Jewish music is, often we think about this as music that extends backwards in time to some extent. How do we think about, and what does it mean to think about music's relationship with Jewish life? Often it starts with what we hear in the present, and it allows us to consider through tunes or through texts or through different kinds of concepts for us to be able to think back into a kind of a sense of tradition. One of the things that I love about this particular program is how that can be done in so many different ways. So, in a sense, one way that we can look at this is to look at history in retrograde. If we were to think, for example, about tunes like Lo Yisagoy or tunes like Hava Nagila, and we can talk about these later, these are tunes that are often viewed as being very, very old. They're really more about 20th century tunes, but nonetheless, they are things that allow us to think back into
I'd like to go
what
back
Jewish
to
history is all
Algeria
about.
because it is, I think,
Similarly, when we look at texts, we see some texts in Hebrew, we see some texts in Yiddish, we see some texts in English that are translations or updates of existing liturgical and other kinds of Jewish devotional texts. That becomes another way to think back to this idea of History 101 from a perspective of the present. And similarly, we also look at different kinds of concepts. And again, I love how these different kinds of ideas about from or connected with composers that identify as Jewish also help to really integrate a kind of a broad story that's not just a story of synagogue music and not just a story of specifically Jewish sounding music, whatever that is. And again, we can talk about how that would work, but also about the idea of Judaism as a civilization, as populations that existed around the world that were part of much broader populations, and populations that have continued to exist for well over 2,000 and more years. Often we tend to think about if we try to think about contributions, and especially if we were to follow what might be considered Western music history, we often envision the idea that there were the ancient Egyptians, and then there were the Phoenicians, and then there were the Israelites, and then there were and then after that there were the Greeks and the Romans, and then moving into Christian music and so on. But in fact, if you look at broader history, we see that Jewish music, just like the musics of many other populations around the world, continued to change and develop and to be able to be practiced in all kinds of exciting and different ways through to the present day. So being able to see things both backwards and forwards is really, to me, one of the great treats of this repertoire and the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think I had, just to be honest, as I began the process of programming, I had a lot of assumptions. I assumed that to try to coalesce this much music, 75 minutes of music by contemporary Jewish composers, there would be subject matters that came back often. And these were assumptions. I assumed there would be Holocaust subject matters. I assumed that there might be heavily religious oriented ideas and subject matters. And instead, what I found was a completely enormous array of texts, subject matters, experiences, musical impetus. There certainly were some traditional musical themes and ideas, and those we'll talk about here in a second. Some of the music was in Hebrew, but the majority of the music was not in Hebrew. So I don't know what I was exactly expecting, but I can tell you what I found. I found an absolutely rich, wide, varied, incredibly beautiful set of contributions to the ever evolving canon of choral music that's happening right now.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the music that's in this program, and that will take us to some other talking points. There were a few pieces that are settings in Hebrew, and we can talk about how composers and why composers, living composers, use Hebrew as their setup. But the very first piece I want to talk to you about is Stacy Garup and her setting. She has two settings on this program, Lo Yisagoy and Hava Nagila. So Hava Nagila is a melody that has basically entered itself into the American psyche. We've heard it at all kind of things. In one of our pre-conversations, we've talked about, you hear it at a sporting event in a stadium, right? We all kind of know this theme. We don't necessarily know what it's from or why this theme is in the kind of collective. But Stacy Garup is a composer I didn't know at all prior to this endeavor, and I want to share with everyone how I found out about her. I've had the wonderful privilege of being guest conductor in Chicago, conducting the Chicago Symphony Chorus in preparation of concerts with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And just to show you the reach of Seraphic Fire, I was in a rehearsal, and on break, one of the singers in the chorus came up to me, and they had just seen Seraphic Fire's electronic submission announcement of the season. And of course, Contemporary Jewish Voices was listed there. So he comes up to me on the break and says, "Hey, James, I see that you're conducting this program about contemporary Jewish music. Have you already gotten all your composers or your program done?" And I said, "Well, actually, no, I've just started." He said, "May I give you a name?" And so he proceeds to tell me about Stacy Garup, a composer that has had some presence there in Chicago because of commissions by a local professional group. And I went down a research pathway of Stacy Garup and fell in love with a lot of her music. She has written for orchestra, she's written operas, she's written choral works, all kinds of genres. And she says herself that she likes to write music that centers on lyrical storytelling. So we're singing two of her works, Lo Yisagoy and Hava Nagila. So talk to us a little bit about that intersection of those traditions.
Mhm. Sure. One of the things that I love about both of these pieces is that they incorporate well-known melodies into what is really an extraordinary kind of choral writing. And having listened to it, it's the Hava Nagila version that or arrangement that Garrett presents certainly goes beyond in all kinds of imaginative ways any other arrangement of Hava Nagila that I am certainly familiar with. Both of these are tunes that, growing up within liberal Jewish life, that many people would be able to understand and be able to kind of recall. They are a part of the 20th century, but again, they invoke something far longer. They invoke a far longer history. In one case, Lo Yisagoy is one that is a text that essentially means that nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor shall they practice war anymore, a very well-known biblical a well-known biblical text that is used in a variety of different ways, not just in Jewish context, because of its message of peace. And that's a key part of the process too. The other thing that's interesting about this work, going to, for example, Hava Nagila, is that Hava Nagila itself is a piece that became well known starting in the 19 teens and 20s and was presented as an arrangement by a well known Jewish music scholar whose name is Avram Tzvi Edelson, as a kind of an arrangement of a Hasidic melody. This one, though, with different lyrics, and in this case, one that took off as having a sound that could be seen in some ways as also having a kind of a Jewish feel. One of the things to listen for in both of these is the kind of modality that's connected to it. So with Lo Yisagoy, there is a sense of a kind of a minor modality that's sometimes seen as being associated with a more traditional Jewish musical style. And in Hava Nagila, just in the first couple of notes of it, you'll hear what would be described as an augmented second. That would be essentially the idea of an expanded interval that also comes off as sounding a little bit exotic. Hava Nagila, that offers a sense of difference that became one of the kinds of ways that Jewish music tried to distinguish itself during the 19th and into the 20th centuries. And so in both of these pieces, what you see is these melodies at the core, but this incredible part writing and incredible setting that Gareb has presented. In the case of Hava Nagila, I remember thinking about how it seems to kind of emerge from a kind of in this case, how would I say it? A kind of an exciting, sort of unclear background, and suddenly emerges with great clarity about 30 or 40 seconds in a way that, again, presents itself in a kind of a sense of building joy, which is what it represents as well. And likewise, in a way that to me certainly made me smile as I was listening to it.
Certainly made me smile too. And I will tell you this, as you were talking at the very beginning about these arrangements, especially Hava Nagila, that it goes beyond anything you've experienced before. This is a seraphic fire model. We love to find that music which is in some circles maybe not able to be performed with as much success that we hope to aspire to, but we do not shy away from that. And so this is an all-star group of singers, as you know, and so I heard the arrangement and thought to myself immediately, this is very difficult, but it is amazingly exciting. It gives, it's certainly, you recognize the melody, you recognize it enough to know that it is the foundation, but there is so much more done with it that it shows the incredible ability of Stacy, and is something that Seraphic Fire will perform, I think, amazingly, and our audiences will truly, truly love to hear this in an elevated place, in an elevated type of environment with really, really spectacular choral writing. So I'm excited to do those pieces with our singers. Another piece that we're going to do, it's actually a set of 4 short works, is by the composer Shulamit Ran. And Shulamit Ran is actually an Israeli-born composer who then emigrated to the United States and lives in New York City now. Major composer as far as has been commissioned by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, the Israeli Philharmonic, operates in some of the highest circles of Western classical music. These 4 incredible little a cappella miniatures, I think the entire set is about 9 minutes, 8.5, 9 minutes. They're on traditional Hebrew texts. The subtitle, I think, is 4 Festive Songs. And Shulamit wrote the pieces, if I'm understanding correctly, as a gift for a bar mitzvah, for the bar mitzvah of her own son. And so this set of pieces has a very personal effect, I think, for her, obviously, but then operates for the choir in a way that allows us to experience this music in a way that doesn't have, as far as I understand, no actual extant folk melody or melodies that might be passed down, but does pay some type of homage to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting and lovely set of pieces. Listening to it, at least from what I was listening to, it reminded me of the kind of mid 20th century style of Israeli choral music, or at least one of them specifically connected with a composer named Yechezkel Brown. Um, this is, of course, entirely original, and I want to make sure that that is clear. Shulamit Ran is one of the great composers of our time, and I actually know her well from an opera that the Jacob School of Music premiered just recently, based on the Diary of Anne Frank. And so, being able to see the range that Shulamit Ran is able to write in is absolutely extraordinary. These pieces, to me, as I listen to them, go back into a kind of a madrigal style, which I find to be really, really very pleasant, a kind of a way to be able to invoke a kind of a simpler past from one perspective, but also to be able to illustrate some really beautiful texts, again, Hebrew texts. Ways to be able to think about this could include looking at these from the perspective, for example, of a first movement that literally is titled "Sing unto God" or "Sing to God," which is a text of celebration. It moves into another text that is connected with the Friday night candle blessings and the blessings over that welcome in Shabbat, and then moves in the third movement into one of the tunes and one of the texts that is sung during the Saturday morning service. And then following that with a fourth movement that, at least as I see it, seems to be connected to what is being asked of, or to be able to talk about some of the key values that are being conferred upon or that are being presented to, in this case, the bar mitzvah boy. So all of these to me speak to this kind of beauty. They speak to a way to be able to illustrate the text in a kind of an open manner, and a way to be able to envision that when we talk about music and its relationship to Hebrew text, we're not just talking about ancient tunes. We're also talking about meaningful illustrations of what the texts mean in a contemporary way, but also as a way to invoke a sense of timelessness.
I think what you just said is what exactly what struck me when I first experienced these pieces, is that although they are new in the sense that it's all new composed, there was a timelessness about it. It felt much older music, and I didn't even think about the ideal of the stylisms and formal structures of madrigals, which of course take us even further back. All of that is layered in these four short movements. Actually, what you just said just put a light bulb in my head. I'm going to explore those scores now in a slightly different way. That's why we have these conversations. We change the gyroscope for each other just a little bit, research and performance. So those are two works that we're going to perform that will be sung in Hebrew. There's another piece, and we don't have to get into too much, but we're going to sing two works by Moira Smiley, and one of the works is in Yiddish. And so here is a variant, right, language, and in this piece, it's essentially a vocal. I think the way I think about it is using some Yiddish and then some repeated syllables. It's the sounds of what she thought her grandmother sounded like when she talked to her. So an actual kind of familial experience. We're also then going to sing another work of Moira Smiley called Stand in That River, which is in English and actually sounds like it comes from Southern American fundamental Christian backgrounds, the kind of musical ideas, but the text itself is essentially neutral in its admonition of what we do. So it is a fascinating set of composers that we're going to sing that use at least some version of Hebrew as its main language. The next composer I really want to talk about, though, is Meredith Monk. And I don't know how many of our patrons or listeners or friends that are here in the conversation have experienced the music of Meredith Monk, either live and recording. But Meredith Monk, we cannot understate how important she has been to the idea of integrating different types of artistic expression simultaneously. So I want to give just a little background information about Meredith Monk. And as far as I know, Seraphic Fire has never performed a single note of Meredith Monk. So I'm excited again about expanding our repertoire. She was born in 1942. She calls herself a composer, performer, director, vocalist, filmmaker, and choreographer. She names herself all those things. And from the 1960s on, she has endeavored to create multidisciplinary works which combine music, theater, and dance. All of these exclusively for ECM records. In choral music, Meredith didn't necessarily, or has not necessarily said, at least outwardly, I am setting down to write a choral piece in a traditional manner, which I will then publish. Instead, she's created these works that we've asked for permission afterwards. Can we please transcribe these into notation that we can follow, and can we recreate the works? It took her a while, actually, to say yes. We have a similar experience with a piece that we've done earlier in Seraphic Fire's history, Ingram Marshall's piece that Patrick asked about, can we do it? And he said no, and then eventually he said yes, and we transcribed it, and we've done it every year since, basically. Meredith Monk, born in New York, her father was a man named Theodore Monk, and her mother's name was Audrey Zellman. And the reason that's important is that Audrey's brother was a bass baritone, a Russian Jewish bass baritone named Joseph Zellman. And so Meredith was around traditional music of the Jewish community in her early life. Now, she identifies as lots of different things. As far as her background, she even identifies as one of the Sami people. But her music is amazing, absolutely fantastic. And we're doing a piece of hers called the Astronaut Anthem, which didn't originally begin as a vocal-only piece, but has subsequently been published as such. And so we're doing that piece. And I just didn't know if you maybe had some thoughts about Meredith Monk and her sense of what she is doing in the musical world.
One of the wonderful things about Meredith Monk and about the very nature of what it means to compose within this kind of a within this kind of a context is to be able to present the idea that when we're talking about contemporary Jewish composers, we really are also talking about people with many different experiences, people that are complex, people that, just like everyone, have many different influences that help to kind of bring them into a creative space. And what's really exciting about Meredith Monk and including her on this program is, again, the idea of how we're really looking at a diversity of experiences. There is no one Jewish experience. And similarly, when we think about even something with a name like Astronaut Anthem, what it means also is that really we are looking at the idea that there is a kind of a broad American set of experiences and an international set of experiences that people bring to their art. This piece really helps to illustrate that, and the extraordinary nature of the artist herself also really brings that to the fore, and again helps to really diversify this already quite diverse program.
Yeah, I think that what she adds to this program is a certain level of richness, but the eclecticism in it is so many things brought together at once, but then still in this in a manner that is highly refined and very pointed and very powerful for the listener and the performer. Another composer we're going to do is a composer that Seraphic Fire has performed before, David Lang. We have performed his Little Match Girl Passion, and David Lang has become a major name in composition all around the world and in choral composition. Many of us know David Lang as the co-founder of Bang on a Can. So this experience kind of got him into the common knowledge, but then he started to write these works, and Little Match Girl Passion is a fantastic piece of music, powerful piece of music, taking the idea of the Christian passion model of other composers like Bach, but moving it into a slightly different subject matter realm while still honoring some of the musical traditions. David Lang, that particular recording, by the way, Little Magical Passion, won a Grammy back a few years ago. But the piece of his that we're going to do is something relatively recent. He actually wrote the piece during the global pandemic back in 2020 and 2021. And for those of us that are in any way associated with Seraphic Fire or a singer or the arts, that was just such a traumatic time. It was for all people, but for a singer, and we discussed it as singers before, to be identified as a super spreader, it added a layer of agita, of angst, about the very art form that we make, which we have to make with our own body, and what a pandemic of that nature meant to us. And so this piece, as I was exploring, I had only heard about it tangentially and never really explored it, and decided this is the time to do this piece. And the piece is called Protect Yourself from Infection. And David Lang, just to give everybody a little information about it, he acquired or found a pamphlet that was distributed during the Spanish flu pandemic back at the very beginning of the 20th century, and uses the exact text from that pamphlet as the core text of this piece. And when hearing it or reading it, it's very uncanny how much of it could have applied exactly to 2020. That even though there was more than 100 years between these two events, that the words were still the same. Now, there is a second layer to this piece, and the singers of Seraphic Fire do not know this part yet, so they may be finding out now. David Lang asks members of the vocal ensemble to sing the names of individuals. In this case, when he originally wrote the piece, they were names of Philadelphians that assisted people during the Spanish flu pandemic: doctors, nurses, caregivers. And the individual singers of Seraphic Fire would sing the names of those people while the other piece is also going on. So what I'm going to ask Seraphic Fire to do for this performance is to actually, each of them will come up with 3 of their own names, people that have assisted them in their own lifetimes during a time of trouble, of sickness, of stress, or of anxiety. And so these will be names that many people would have never, ever heard in a performance, and they will be overlaid into this David Lang piece. So my question to you is about the nature of this kind of using materials and cyclical materials, and of course this, a completely seemingly non-artistic material, to create this experience, and the honoring of the names in performance.
Mhm. There is, I find this to be also just a wonderful and really deeply meaningful piece, and one that is evocative not just of 4 years ago, but also, as you're describing, a way for us to be able to link with a past that is itself traumatic on one side, but also has created these kinds of sources that, as we listen to them, both remind us of that trauma that exists, that we experienced during the pandemic, while at the same time being stilted enough for us to be able to kind of get a sense of distance from this as well. Adding the names into this also speaks to a really important way to be able to honor the folks that we would consider to be an important part of addressing these kinds of moments of difficulty. To me, that was something that was fascinating as I was listening to the piece itself, and also to see how the references to names seemed also to speak to, or to find their ways between these kinds of more traditional choral, if you will, traditional, but these kinds of much more homophonic choral sections. And to me, being able to have that kind of interplay it was really, really interesting. I found it to be just a wonderful way to be able to create a sense of structure, and then to be able to see more deeply how that structure starts to illustrate not only history, but the way that we perceive these events that are now over a century apart.
Thank you. Before we dive into the last little portion of our conversation, if there's anyone, we will have enough time for a Q&A session with those of you here in our Zoom room. If you would please send your questions via the chat function directly to Alexis Amay, our podcast producer, we will be able to unmute you and you can ask your question live on Zoom, or if you prefer for me to just voice your question instead, just let Alexis know in the chat. So if you have your questions, now's the time to start getting those to Alexis through the chat, and then we will be able to answer them here in our last few minutes. On our program, and this is something we didn't talk about, Judah, though, we have a world premiere. And this is also something that I was hoping to be able to do uh, in this program. And we have two movements of a slightly larger work, but two movements by the young composer Yoni Fogelman. And Yoni wrote a set of basically love texts to a Rose and Alice of Aspen, uh, specifically for these performances, and created new editions for us. And Yoni is going to be flying to Miami to, I think he's going to come to two of the performances. And so this program, in addition to having significant voices, living contemporary Jewish composers, names that we know, like Meredith Monk and David Lang and Julia Wolf and Shulamit Ron, some of the biggest players in the musical field today, we're going to have the opportunity to hear perhaps the next major player in the musical field of composition. Yoni is a young man that I've come to know through his program at UCLA. It's always good to know somebody, as you know. And so we're going to get to premiere his work in this set of programs, as well as all of the music we've talked about and other composers. So it's a significant time for Seraphic to do this program. It's a significant place in the kind of constellation of the Music 101 programs we're offering this year. And it is absolutely a program in which I believe our listeners will learn something, but they will feel something for sure. And they will come away with, hopefully, an idea of what this entire thing is about. So thank you so much, Judah. And if you have any kind of final comments you'd like to make to us before we make some questions, we'll certainly take them.
The only comment I'd make, James, and again, it's really such a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you, is first of all, the idea of being able to think broadly about what it means to be a Jewish composer and to be able to think about what it means to be a contemporary Jewish composer. And I'd like to sort of end with a quick comment on the other part, or the other piece of David Lang's that's being performed as well, which I think is really meaningful here also. The term or the title of it, Make Peace, is also evocative of, and actually a translation of, a key Jewish liturgical text that often is sung at the end of what's described as the Amidah, or the standing prayer, a long silent prayer that is one of the key parts of the Jewish liturgy. And at the very end is a kind of a request that says, make peace. Make peace, and again, as it says here, in the heavens, in us, in all the world, make peace. The original text is one that really refers to a kind of a divine creator of peace. And one of the things I love about what Lang is doing in this case is trying to put this in a conditional sense. If you can make peace in the heavens, in us, in all the world. And then it goes into the command, make peace. To me, that is a wonderful way to be able to think as well of, and to be able to offer a lens into this broad and wonderful program that Seraphic Fire is presenting.
Thank you so much for that. And Judah, we do have some questions that our audience members would like to share. So let's make sure we save a little time for that and try to answer them as fully as we can. So I believe Jordan is up first, and in just a second, when we unmute Jordan, they will ask their question.
Hello, I'm a big fan of Sorry Fire as always, and I have two moderately sized questions. So I'll ask one, and then I'll see if you have time for that a second. The first one is that, before the Torah was written down, there was the Jewish oral tradition, right? And then it made me think that some indigenous communities in America have a tradition of singing songs per se, but these songs are more of traditions to keep certain stories and certain laws of the land alive. So I was wondering if there's any tradition like that in the Jewish or tradition of like singing to make something more memorable, right? I'm asking if there's anything like that.
Mhm.
And that's like,
I'm sorry, were you? I got your first question, and I'm thrilled to be able to answer it. And again, I can answer briefly now, but as you could imagine, this is part of a much, much longer and larger discussion. One of the things that has been interesting for me in studying music related to Jewish life and history is the sense that, from one perspective, Jews are perceived as the people of the book, that is to say, based on the written word. But when studying music, you get a very different kind of a feel. Music is something that is much harder to write down, as you know. And even though it can be written down, the performance itself goes beyond the written page and goes beyond any kind of notation. So, one of the things that is really interesting that I found about music is that music helps not only to interpret written text in new ways, but also to be able, in that process, to be able to tell those stories that go beyond what can be written, to be able to allow communities, just as you're describing, to be able to allow communities to be able to share their experiences through this a sense of inheriting sound from one generation to the next, even as that inheriting often leads to change as well. So I think that you do an excellent job being able to describe it, and it's a fantastic question.
And then the second one was a certain Jewish aestheticism, because there's been some issues of trying to appreciate art from the indigenous and other cultures as cultural appropriation. But I think um, there's ways to appreciate cross-cultural works, right? But in order to do that, you have to understand the culture. So I was asking if there's anything that we should know about Jewish culture to fully appreciate the program list.
It's a huge question and an excellent question. The way that I would start, and again, part of it here, which I find to be really interesting, is to start with a very kind of core story that I grew up with. And that story is associated with someone who goes up to a very famous rabbi, and this is now, a couple thousand years ago, who says, explain the entire Torah, explain all of Jewish text to me. The rabbi looks at this person and says, I can't do that. You're not ready. You don't have the opportunity. You don't know the text. I don't think I can do that, and walks away. The person then goes up to a different rabbi, and this again is an important situation here where they go to a rabbi, and this is the one that tells the right answer. The person goes to the same or asks the same question and says, I'm going to stand on one foot, and I'd like you to teach all of the Torah to me. The rabbi takes a moment and thinks, and then says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The rest is all commentary. Go and learn. And from one perspective, one of the things that I see within this is a sense that when we start to look at Jewish culture and Jewish history, from one perspective, it is incredibly diverse. You can't necessarily say that there's one culture or one history or one experience. Just like with Indigenous peoples, just like with anybody else, there's an extraordinary sense that there are so many different ways to be able to identify. And yet, at the same time, the aspect of going and learning becomes a central one. Listening, trying to hear how people try to identify themselves in sound and how they try to present their own histories by creating sounds that can sit alongside what they see as the mainline or mainstream sounds of their particular culture. So keep listening, keep learning, and this again offers a wonderful way into that kind of listening and that kind of appreciation. Thank you for that question.
Yes, Jordan, thank you very much. We have a question from Beth Braswell.
Hi, James. So I know when we had the October Scholar Lecture, one of the things that Patrick talked about was the challenges that the Seraphic Fire singers had in singing 1,000 years worth of music and how singing changed over that 1,000 years. So I was wondering, I know that the singers are extraordinarily talented, but are there any specific challenges in singing this style of music or the pieces that you've chosen?
Excellent question, and us conductors always love to talk about the insides out, right? It's we don't just ask us what time it is. Let us tell you how we built the watch, and then you can tell what time it is, right? We love doing that. So I would imagine, of course, and I was not on the last program, when you're going over 1,000 years of music, it's just an enormous amount of stylisms and practices in music change so much over that time, right? The type of music that we make. This program is different in the fact that almost all the music was written within the last 60 years. So this is a much more compact musical time period. However, because of the composers having had the ability, all these composers, of researching, knowing, experiencing, feeling, listening to all of the music of 1,000 years of Western music and other cultures and ethnomusicological studies, this music is infused in a way that is incredibly dense in places and very listenable, but it requires the singers to sing extreme ranges. If last program was 1,000 years of history, this is a program of 1,000 iterations of rhythm. There are lots of rhythmic ideas in these pieces. This is complex rhythmic music, much of it. And the singers will have to be on their best counting game, so to speak. Obviously, we will have to be singing at least in 3 languages, and if we count Yiddish as an additional language with a slant towards Hebrew. The singers have to take on roles within these texts that are not always completely straightforward, like meaning a singer has to make an interpretation for themselves. And it just has the gymnastics aspect of the vocalism all within the period of 75 minutes. So there really is a tremendous amount the singers have to do in this case, although all the music was written in the last 60 years. All right, I have a question here. It says, when working on a world premiere of a piece, what sort of responsibility do you feel as a conductor and as an ensemble? This is a really, really, it's actually quite heavy question. We always want to try to get things, quote, right as musicians and as conductors. Although sometimes we may not know what the exact right is, we have a sense of what that right is, right? We have the opportunity to lean on scholarship, to listen to recordings of distinguished colleagues, to understand through reading, this is how we think they may have treated trills in the Baroque. And so we're coming to it with an informed position as a musician first. World premieres, you're getting the clock of learning starts the minute you get the score, right? And you're learning about the composer. You're trying to learn about what that composer has written about, learning about, okay, what are the things that the ensemble is going to have to perform? And then we have a sense, I at least can speak for myself, we have a sense, and I just said this to the UCLA students, because we're about to make a world premiere recording of something, that you, us, we, could be a part of someone else's scholarship down the road. Because if they start to investigate this composer or this text or this entity, here is the first performance of that work ever. You are now a part of the beginning of the research continuum on something that is musically and artistically born in front of you all. So there is a great deal of responsibility. I will say that I hope to say this in a way that doesn't get me in trouble. Working with living composers can be absolutely a two-edged sword. It can be wonderful because you can say, hey, I have a question. Can we talk about this? And you can actually speak to the composer. You also have a composer saying, well, I don't think it should go like that. Or they're inserting themselves into the interpretation of the work, which sometimes I think needs to be left to the ensemble as much as possible. So it's a fantastic responsibility. It is a responsibility we at Seraphic Fire, for our entire existence, world premieres, we have embraced. We embrace that, and many of our wonderful colleagues around the country as ensembles do the same. It's how we grow listeners, canon, and research. So these are all important things, and thanks for that excellent question. Well, I have that we're almost at the top of the hour, And before we leave, I would like to give a hearty Seraphic Fire-sized thank you to Judah Cohen for your expertise and your time and your compassion with us today. Judah, thank you so much.
Thank you, James. Again, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the questions, the conversation. And again, I wish you all the best, and I wish Seraphic Fire the best on this fantastic program, which I know will be an extraordinary experience.
Well, on behalf of all of us at Seraphic Fire, I, James Bass, Associate Conductor, want to thank all of you for coming and spending a little bit of your time with us today, and absolutely look forward to hopefully seeing all of you in just a few weeks to hear all of this information come to fruition in live format. Thank you, everyone. It's great to see you all, and hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye.